So welcome again to all our participants. It's about 2 minutes after the hour, 3 minutes after the hour, at least on my screen here. Welcome to this webinar on the key principles for the decarbonization of the European building stock, bringing together energy efficiency, circular economy, and whole life carbon. And you can see already with this long title that we are going to address a number of challenges because we want to have a comprehensive look at the decarbonization challenge for the European building stock. So we're really trying to discuss solutions, how we can make sure that we are promoting energy efficiency, that we are promoting circular economy, and that we are promoting the reduction of the whole life carbon impact of our buildings. My name is Oliver Rapf. I'm the Executive Director of BPIE, a non-profit think tank based in Brussels. And we are organizing this webinar in collaboration with EEB and ECOS. And I would like to thank the colleagues of these two organizations already now for the great collaboration in preparing the event. We will also get contributions from them in a moment, and we have a number of speakers today. The way we have organized the webinar is that we just have 3 introductory speeches, 3 introductory contributions to kick us off, and then we will have 2 different panels. The first panel will give us an industry perspective on the topic as such, and the second panel will give us a policy perspective. And what we want to do in these panels is we want to answer and react to the questions from the audience. So please feel free to send us your questions, your comments in the Q&A box, which you hopefully see at the bottom of your screen if you hover with your mouse over the screen. So please feel free to use that Q&A box. I will try to monitor that as closely as possible, but I'm not promising to address all the questions you will raise. We will do our best, but we also have limited time. I also wanted to stress that we are recording this webinar. So if you do not agree with the recording, you will unfortunately have to leave the webinar. That's the only choice. And we will, of course, share the link to the recording later via our usual digital platforms. And with that, I would already like to welcome the first speaker, who's Scholt Todd, a colleague of mine. He's a senior project manager at BPIE. He has been working on the topic of whole life carbon for quite a while already, I should say, for many years in the end. And he will talk about the principles to integrate whole life carbon in building regulations, cover a bit where we currently stand in the debate, and well, help us to get into the discussion. So, Scholt, the floor is yours for the next round about 9 minutes.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Oliver. And good afternoon to everyone also from my side. I'm going to share my screen. Just bear with me for a second and we get this going immediately. Right. So before actually getting to talk about the draft principles for integrating whole life carbon considerations in building related policies, I just wanted maybe to provide still a bit of a background to our event today, because I think it's important to remind you where we are coming from and what we try to do actually with this with this discussion today. So the event today is actually a follow-up of an informal discussion we had just before the summer this year. And we had this with the key stakeholders. For us, we just wanted to understand who are really the important actors when it comes to considering whole life carbon principles and whole life carbon regulation in buildings. So we had representatives of research authorities, public authorities, NGOs, industry associations, and so on. And we also just wanted to understand what the perspectives and the concerns are of these different parties. And so, as I said, this took place just before the summer. Now, one of the key outcomes of the discussions we had was that was a unanimous conclusion that we all need to take action on whole life carbon. And maybe the differences in relation to the concerns and the different perspectives were related actually to the pace of the travel, as well as how we are going to address some of the major barriers. Some of the major barriers were, of course, related to the availability and reliability of the data, but I'm going to talk about this in a second. So the workshop today is mostly about whole life carbon and energy efficiency, but I thought it would be useful for us just to bring up the energy efficiency first principle, because I think this is also something that most of you who are in the audience today are more familiar with. And the principles for whole life carbon that we envisage is that it would function in a similar way to the energy efficiency principle. So it's not about replacing energy efficiency first, but it's more about complementing it, and it's making sure that essentially the energy efficiency objectives are climate proof, they are aligned with climate outcomes. So if you know that energy efficiency is essentially a guiding principle to make sure that decisions, be that at individual project level or policy or investment levels, are in fact taking into account cost-effective energy efficiency measures first. So that is the same sort of function, there is the same sort of role that whole life carbon should and could fulfill as well. I'm going to talk about this in a second. So while still somewhat at the setting of the scene and providing the context, it's very important to reflect a bit on the baseline, because this is something that we still need to come to grips with. And we know that today, more or less, the balance between embodied emissions and operational emissions, most of the studies put it to somewhere 20% and 80% operational carbon. And we also know that the importance of the embodied emissions is going to rise due to the fact that more ambitious building regulations will come into force. And we also know that the upfront emissions happen usually in a short burst of time, whereas operational emissions are cumulative and they are just sort of accruing over a long period of time, over the entire lifespan of the building. But I think now looking at also what happens in Glasgow these weeks, I think it's very important to put this in a slightly different perspective, because these figures talk about a building lifetime of about 50, 60 years. Whereas if we are going to reflect of the tipping point that we set for ourselves, that is 2050, then essentially we are just looking at, let's say, the half of this lifetime for the buildings that are built today or renovated today. So essentially, if we put this in perspective, that means that these figures are in fact the importance of embodied emissions is actually twice as much as these reports suggest. And the same sort of argument you can see here as well, just insisting again on the time value, the time relevance of the carbon. In what word, when do we need to take action when we are about to decarbonize the building sector? So what you can see here is the solid black line shows the historical emissions, which you see have not even plateaued. And these other colored lines are in fact the track, the pathway that we need to take in order not to miss our 2050 carbon budget. So that means, in a way, that if we are not going to take action on these upfront emissions right away, it means that we will have very little chance actually to act on other decarbonization measures, such as the grid, or to reduce future operational energy use. So in other words, what I'm saying here is that it will actually not matter if we will have energy efficient buildings in 2050 or 2060, because what matters is that now we have to reduce these emissions. Okay, and the whole life carbon principle is also something that could contribute to the alignment of the policy framework, because it's very clear from this table as well that actually meaningfully addressing all life carbon emissions from the buildings will require consistent policy action across all these different life cycle stages of the buildings. Okay, and finally about the data. You see that measuring whole life carbon is actually much more difficult than measuring energy consumption, which also means in a way that regulating whole life carbon is also slightly more difficult than energy efficiency. In a way, it's not as simple as you would install a meter before the construction works or the renovation works commence. And then once the work has been done, you just read the meter and that gives you the upfront emissions. In fact, we do work with assumptions, we do work with imperfect data. So fixing the data quality and the data availability is very important. But what you can also see from this slide is that it requires quite a lot of time and many policy measures to be in place. So therefore, my question actually with this slide is that how much data we need to move on with whole life carbon regulation. And there is actually one question that I would like to, the panelists later on to pick up and just reflect on the fact, if we can wait indeed until we have all this sorted out, until we have the perfect metrics, and until we have comparable product level data. So when can we actually move forward with whole life carbon regulation? And finally, the draft principles that we would like to put forward for discussion for the panel, but also for the audience, are the following. So whole life carbon principles prioritize all carbon reductions related to building construction, renovation, maintenance, and operation, unless it results in unreasonable adverse social or financial consequences. This means, in fact, that we are not going to deplete our carbon budget. We need this in order not to tip over the irreversible climate change. So it also ensures that in a way that the remaining carbon is allocated in the right way, and we make good use of what is still left of it. Second principle is that, similar to the energy efficiency first principle, is the whole life carbon is a decision principle that is applied systematically, both at policy level, but also at individual building level. Now, to apply this principle, it's very clear that we need a supporting framework. We need the tools, we need the reliable metrics, we need transparency, we need accountability. That means also credibility. So that is one of the issues that we have today, that we all know that we have certain issues around the comparability and the consistency of these metrics. So that is something that will need to be fixed in the short time. And finally, the whole life carbon principle is, as I explained with energy efficiency first, is to balance the principles of energy efficiency first, but also the other environmental and social priorities we have. So as I said before, it's just making sure that the energy saving measures will also deliver the maximum carbon reductions. And with that, I hand over back the floor to Oliver.
Sure, thank you very much for drawing our attention again to the urgency, to that steep decline which we need to achieve with our climate impact, with our carbon emissions, with our greenhouse gas emissions, in order to be aligned with the ambition of the Paris Agreement to stay well below 2 degrees, and ideally to limit global warming, the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. Thank you also for suggesting the draft principles to integrate whole life carbon in building regulations. We're now going to look at the question, well, how can we integrate circularity, the circularity idea in building regulation? And our next speaker will be Gonzalo Sanchez, who is a policy officer for circular economy and carbon neutrality in the building sector with EEB. EEB stands for the European Environmental Bureau, which is an umbrella organization, an NGO based here in Brussels, with 170 members, and these members come from over 35 countries. So Gonzalo, your community has a really wide reach. You are representing a lot of green interest groups in many, many European countries. And I look very much forward to your ideas on the principles to integrate circularity in building regulations. And I think we have to probably switch the screen. Scholz, you have to stop sharing your screen, and Gonzalo, you will then be in the center of the attention.
Yeah.
So please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, and Oliver, let me just share my screen. Can you see my screen? Yeah.
Yes, it's working.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thanks, Oliver. I'm glad to present figures that show us why circularity and sufficiency are essential for decarbonizing the European building stock and ensuring a whole life cycle approach. Well, linking these topics to Scholz's presentation, I would like to remind that circularity and sufficiency directly impact the whole life cycle of buildings. The aim is to reduce the use of raw materials, reduce construction waste, and extend the lifespan of buildings to avoid unnecessary new constructions and the increase of square meters consumption. And this is why circularity and sufficiency are strategies which go hand in hand with energy efficiency to implement a whole life carbon approach of buildings. But the question on why not just focus on energy efficiency is because there are several issues that energy efficiency cannot tackle, but circularity and sufficiency could address. And this is the key point. For instance, this graphic shows us that energy efficiency measures have decreased the energy demand per square meters, as you can see in the red line, but the increasing of consumption on square meters per capita has hampered a higher reduction in energy demand per capita, which is represented by the black line in this graphic. Moreover, you can see in this red column in this graphic that the increase in CO2 emissions due to the lack of policies on circularity and sufficiency has neutralized the reduction of CO2 emissions achieved by energy efficiency from 1919 to 2018. As Scholz mentioned before, the key point in this discussion is the embodied emissions. Around 11% of global emissions are from embodied carbon of building materials, and in some countries could reach around 40%. And beyond the operational phase, many of other portions of energy use are embodied into direct and indirect processes related to materials. And in this graphic it shows the impact that circularity and sufficiency measures could have. You can see that in the red column, so as to reduce embodied emissions generated by new buildings compared to energy efficiency and renewables measures. Well, in this graphic, we have 4 different scenarios presented based on the potential increase of global warming. And in all scenarios, circularity and sufficiency has the most important role. And well, in general, these are just some key points to consider in the current situation on circularity across Europe. We know that the majority of construction and demolition waste component could be reprocessed. The technology for separation and recovery is well established across Europe. Despite this, the level of recycling and material recovery of construction and demolition waste varies widely across the European Union. Circularity is not well introduced in national codes, and most new buildings are not reversible. New constructions have higher priority than renovation so far, and there is a need to establish harmonized standards and create a robust local market on circularity. Therefore, and there's this clear need to promote the circular economy in the construction sector and base it on the current situation. The challenge is how to include this circular and sufficiency approach in the European policy, overcoming the existing barriers. So to frame the discussion for the panelists, I want to present some of the key topics related to the circularity that are currently discussed on the 3 main European policies of buildings. As mentioned before, circularity and sufficiency are cross-cutting issues that each policy should address. When it comes to the construction product regulation, there are two key points, which are establishing requirements for information such as a bill of materials and instructions for disassembly to support circular use of products, and establishing minimum performance requirements for circularity based on performance indicators, including durability, reparability, usability, and recyclability. When it comes to the EPBD, the EPBD could address both operational energy use and embodied impacts that tackles carbon embodied emissions in both buildings and construction materials, could promote reversibility and adaptability of new buildings and large renovations, could also establish mandatory use of reused and recycled materials in new buildings and renovations, and could prioritize on renovations rather than new buildings. And regarding the Waste Directive, there are some key points that we can consider, which is establishing harmonized standards on circularity and mandatory pre-demolition audits, and increasing to a minimum of 90% by weight the preparation for reuse, recycling, and other material recovery on non-hazardous construction and demolition waste, avoiding landfilling. And well, all these potential policy approaches and discussions has to be supported by financial incentives that ensure a proper market across Europe, which is also one of the key points to implement this approach across Europe. So I think I stop here, and looking forward to listening to the next speakers and the reaction from the panelists. Thank you, Oliver.
Thank you very much, Gonzalo, for these ideas, how to introduce a regulation for circularity, which files to look at. We're now going to hear from Philip Mosley, who actually represents the legislator, the regulator. Philip Mosley is a policy officer at DG Grow at the construction unit. And I think it's your daily bread and butter, what you have just heard. What transition pathway do you see for the construction sector when it comes to circularity and whole life carbon? I know there are quite a number of intensive discussions going on these topics inside the European Commission. So I'm looking forward to hear the latest on that and maybe learn a little bit about the challenges which you're facing in coming up with legislative proposals. Philip, thank you very much for joining us. The virtual microphone is yours.
Thank you. I'm just checking that you can see my slides correctly.
At the moment, not. I can see you on camera, but not the slides yet.
Not, okay. Let me just try again then. Sorry, because I didn't share my screen. I just went into, right, share, that's it. And
it's starting up at the moment.
Right.
Yes, now we can see it. And
like that?
Now, yes, now it's there,
Good.
but it's on my screen, it's too big.
It's too big.
Martina, can you confirm that it's good, well visible for the rest?
No, actually, it's too big for everyone. If you can try again.
Okay, let me just wait a minute.
Yes.
I'll try like this. And like that.
Now it seems to be working well, though I can see two dark bars, one horizontal, one vertical. But this
that's the zoom thing. I'll just move that out of the way. And this one. Is that better?
Yes, now it's perfect.
Okay.
Thank you, Philip.
Good.
Please
Thanks.
go ahead.
Sorry about that. Right. So yes, I'm working in the construction unit in DG Grow. I'm responsible there for circular economy, everything to do with circularity, also DG Grow's input to the energy aspects of construction. So anything you might deem sustainable, basically, in construction comes my way. Now, on the construction industry ecosystem, as we call it, since the industrial strategy was updated, there's a very precise definition of the industry ecosystem in the single market report, which you can see on the slide there. and some statistics there of not only the economic side of it, but the environmental side, the waste, and the operational greenhouse gas emissions, that figure that we always see, the 36%. And of course, we don't really have at the moment yet a very clear and accurate figure for the embodied emissions of construction activity in the EU, something I'm hoping that we'll be working on and we can rectify soon. Now, what we've been doing is coordinating this work on a transition pathway for construction. So all the 14 industrial ecosystems of the industrial strategy are doing these transition pathways. There's already one out for the energy intensive industries. And these are looking at the green and digital transition, but they also look at resilience. And we kicked that off with a meeting of the High Level Construction Forum in September. And we're following that up. What we're going to be doing by the end of this year is coming out with a staff working document that will propose scenarios for a transition pathway for construction. So we've been getting lots of inputs from stakeholders like many of you, and also member state authorities have been sending us input. It'll set out essentially the status quo across the whole of what we need to be looking at. And then next year, we'll be carrying on with the transition pathway work, where we'll be co-creating with industry and stakeholders new action, effectively, new pledges, looking at what more needs to be done to move forward. So we'll be carrying on with that. There are quite a number of ongoing pieces of work on circularity. Some of it related directly to whole life carbon, but all of it's indirectly related, as we've heard. Under these two big strategies, the Circular Economy Action Plan and the Renovation Wave. So there are several actions there, which are mostly studies. Some of them, like the waste ones, are related to the possible future revision of the Waste Framework Directive. Then we have the roadmap to reduce whole life carbon in buildings under the Renovation Wave, which is just starting up now, and hopefully will generate some new data that we can work with. And also we have the green public procurement criteria under the Renovation Wave. And then there's another initiative there which we lead at DG Grow, the Big Buyers Initiative, which is on procurement. And it essentially gets big procurers to exchange with each other, and they have a working group on circular economy in construction to exchange on that topic. On a whole life cycle greenhouse gas emissions specifically, we have already the levels framework, which has the indicator for global warming potential. So we already have a framework there for measuring and reporting on life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, and the levels framework has been making its way gradually into various different policies. So it's a very important and useful starting point, and we encourage all of the industry to be using the levels indicators now, not only for whole life carbon, but for other environmental impacts as well. We have the roadmap, as I mentioned, and then, as you can see in the Energy Efficiency Directive, whole life carbon now is starting to make its way into legislation. Maybe people didn't expect this in the EED, but we have 2 articles in there now that mention whole life carbon. The article, they've been renumbered compared to the existing EPBD, so EED. So it's Article 6 now in the revised proposal on the exemplary role of public bodies buildings. This is the article that requires a 3% annual renovation rate for public buildings. At the moment, only for central government buildings. In the revision, it's proposed for all public authorities. So you're really going from just the capital cities' public buildings to every little town across the entire country. So it's a massive increase in that. And at the moment, in that article in the current directive, there's a kind of a paragraph that allows public authorities to count demolition and reconstruction as renovation, as long as the reconstruction takes place within 2 years. And in order to discourage demolition, or at least to think about it more, the proposal would require public authorities that are considering demolition to carry out a whole life carbon assessment to compare that with a renovation. And it's really to encourage the actual renovation of buildings rather than pulling them down. And then on the Article 7 of public procurement, there's also some text in there that would encourage member states to consider other environmental impacts beyond energy efficiency, including the whole life carbon using the levels indicators I mentioned. We also have the EU taxonomy for sustainable activities, which is to direct investments towards defining what we mean by sustainability in investments for finance. So there's ongoing work by the Platform on Sustainable Finance, which is a platform of stakeholders. I'm sure many of you are actually involved in some of it. So they are preparing new criteria on water, biodiversity, pollution, and circular economy. These are going beyond the already published criteria for climate change mitigation and adaptation. So there is ongoing work there on circular economy in construction. And also it's worth noting that the whole life carbon is already mentioned in the climate side of it. So that the taxonomy could really start to divert or to prioritize investment decisions to sustainable activities. Then we have a couple of documents that we have recently published. We have the guidance on the right there from last year that is a guidance document on design of buildings using circular economy, and it's aimed at various different target groups, designers, policymakers, and so on. And we followed that up with a study this year that looked at policy options, including for several of these pieces of legislation that have been mentioned, but also it looks at options for things like standardization, research needs, and so on. So and it collected case studies of national and regional policies across Europe and further afield, some OECD countries as well, and pulled that together to recommend some policy options, and we're now following up on those. We also have, as we've heard, the revision ongoing of the construction products regulation, which is done in my unit in DG GROW, coordinating that. So the regulation lays down the EU-wide rules for marketing of construction products across the single market. So these are the CE marking of construction products. The regulation hasn't been working as well as it should from the point of view of marketing construction products in a harmonized way across the EU, but also at the moment it doesn't sufficiently integrate sustainability requirements. So we are looking into all of these things to ensure that data coming through using the regulation will be coming through in a consistent way. And so that's crucial if we're going to be using data from construction products for things like life cycle analysis calculations across the whole single market. And then we have EU funding programs also working on whole life carbon. So we have the kind of going from the bottom up here, we have the LIFE program working on across circular economy, also climate and energy transition. And there in the LIFE program, there are also projects looking at skills, for example. So there are some projects now starting under the Build Up Skills initiative, looking at circular economy in construction, which is very useful. Then in the Horizon Europe Research and Innovation Program, there's a lot of funding in there now for buildings and construction, primarily under the Built for People partnership, which is looking very holistically at the entire value chain. Because when it comes to circularity and life cycle carbon, we can't really just look in isolation at one area. We need to work with the whole value chain together, and that's the idea of the Built for People partnership. This whole value chain approach and setting up or working with existing innovation clusters in every member state. And then the massive funding there, the next generation EU, which includes the national recovery and resilience plans of the member states. We've been working with the member states to ensure that circular economy is taken into consideration when they put together their renovation programs, because virtually every member state has been putting a lot of money through that into renovation, which is excellent to see. But of course, what we don't want is that the huge increase in renovation doesn't come at the same time with a huge increase in waste and resource extraction and therefore more carbon emissions. So we've been supporting member states to look at those in an integrated way. So I think, in conclusion, what I think I can say is that we're looking at whole life carbon really now from a range of different angles. It's not just one policy. It's a complex issue that needs action across a range of different funding programs and different policies and measures and voluntary measures and so on. So it's gone very high on the agenda in the Commission. Everybody's aware of it now, and it's something that we're taking very seriously. So thank you very much, and I'll be looking forward to the debate later on.
Thank you very much, Philip. Well, we're moving right into the debate because we're starting the industry panel right now, and I'm very keen to learn what the industry actually thinks about all these initiatives which the European Commission has already launched or is thinking about launching. I'd like to welcome our panelists. Peter Andreas Sattrup is a senior advisor in the Danish Association for Architectural Firms. We have Jonna Biscata, who's the head of the EU Public Affairs at Kingspan Global. Then we have Christine Lemaitre, who's the CEO of the German Sustainable Building Council, DGNB. And we have Ian Condren, who's the Corporate Development Director at Ecosem. And Philip, these are all your panelists who will be in a discussion with you because you're staying on the panel. Maybe you're a little bit in the hot seat here as the legislator together with the industry, but I'm sure we can have a lively and constructive discussion. And let me just maybe kick off with a first question. I also want to reflect some of the questions which we get in the chat, and just a really brief question to you, Philip. Is the intention actually to decarbonize the construction industry or the building stock or both? And how do you see the relationship between the two? That was one of the questions which came in from the chat.
Yeah, that's a good question because, you know, we use these terms building stock and construction industry almost as if they're the same thing. But, you know, decarbonizing the building stock, you know, what we understand by that in general, and that phrase turns up a lot in, you know, in the past as well, is decarbonizing the energy consumption of the building. So, you know, that has been the priority for a long time now. But at the same time, where, you know, it's becoming increasingly obvious that we need to also address the emissions of construction, but not only construction, but also demolition. And a lot of what can be done is at the early stages. It's in the design stage and in the decisions, investment decisions, and so on. So you know, there's a big role for designers in this. Of course, we can help them by putting the right frameworks in place. But you know, as we've heard, designing buildings and renovations that can be then dismantled at the end of life, or that don't need to be just smashed up and go to landfill, is key.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. That is an excellent lead. Sorry, an excellent lead to Peter, who is an architect who represents architects. Can the architects actually integrate whole life carbon and circularity into their design work, or is it just another burden and something you're not really very happy about?
Oh yes, certainly. There's a lot to be done, and I'm happy that that we have a recognition of the power of the architects up front here for today's discussion. So I'm happy with that. I also think this is a very exciting time to be an architect, because we can really deliver the material choices that architects take along with their clients have a massive carbon footprint, and we can definitely substitute some materials for others. We can optimize constructions. We can look at the process. We can shape more interesting buildings that have a lower footprint and so on. There are lots of ways that architects can really reduce the carbon footprint of buildings. Just looking at on some of our best member companies, they show that that we can reduce the carbon footprint by more than half, just by relatively ordinary technologies that are available today, and it doesn't have to cost much extra, if anything at all.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Peter. You're saying we can. I
Yes,
often heard we can. I'm wondering to what degree is it already happening, and it's not something which is happening sometime in the future. Can you give me a percentage, maybe just of what's your guess? How many of the architectural firms which are represented in your association take the issue at the core of their business and try to develop solutions? Just a rough percentage, a gut feeling, not a scientifically evidenced figure.
That's a very tough call to make, because we have big companies, small companies, and most small companies, but the biggest one are the ones with the impacts, right? The big ones are already on they're on track to deliver. They have the technologies. They use the modeling tools. They can perform life cycle assessments and so on. It's an integrated part of their design processes if they can get the client along with it. So it's possible. The problem really, or the main effort, is getting the smaller companies, the mainstream of construction, the entire construction sector. Of course, it's not only the architects who pull, the decisions here. We have to get everybody along. But definitely, there's a critical mass of competences in the field, at least in our context here.
Thanks a lot, Peter. Christine, the DGNB is doing a lot of certification, certifying buildings. To what degree do you see a growth in, attention from your clients on the topic of whole life carbon? And is that something you're including already as a standard in your certifications?
Yes, we do. Since the system is basically on the market since 2009, we have included that they have to do an LCA, they have to do life cycle costing. We have a criteria for the question of deconstruction of a building. So already during design, they have to answer these questions. And I would say since 2009, since today, it really picked up. I think at least, especially in the past years. I mean, when I remember in 2009, when I presented our certification system internationally, people were laughing at me like, the German nerds, an LCA of a building, how should that work? And the data, and everyone talks about life cycle assessment, about embodied carbon. I think maybe even to an extent where you wonder, that we should not leave the goal out of the perspective. Part of the whole life carbon is that you look at the building as a whole, that the operational part is still a big challenge we have to face. We have to reduce the operational carbon, the emissions from the in use phase. So I think it has really picked up, especially amongst architects. And I have to say the good thing, about certifications, always a lot of discussions, especially from investors and clients, do I really need that? But I would say after the first certifications, we don't have to discuss life cycle assessment. That is really a given. So every client who does a DGNB certification, they know they have to do it. And they don't really, they don't try to discuss it anymore. They don't try to get out. So it's more like the social aspects of it. So I would say it really,
I think
it's solid.
Christine, there seems to be a small issue with your internet connection. We couldn't hear the last sentence.
Am I back now?
Yes, you're back now.
Okay, I'm sorry. No, I just said I agree with Peter Andreas. I think, you know, the knowledge is there. I think the big companies, they already have it part as their DNA. I think Europe just declared at the COP that they will do an LCA for every project they're doing, even if the client didn't order it. So I think now the challenge is really to scale it up and to bring it as well to small firms, to small investors, because they don't have the resources and the time to go to trainings and to get educated. So I think this is the big challenge we're facing now, to really scale it up and to make it, like we call it, the new normal for every project.
Thank you. Jonna, Kingspan is a very large company producing many different kinds of construction materials. What do you think about that potential growth in demand from your clients, whether it's the developers, the construction companies, to have more information on the life cycle impact, on the whole life carbon impact of the building materials? What's Kingspan doing in that respect?
Yeah, definitely there's more demand, and we are doing getting the environmental data, embodied carbon, and also circularity information, and doing environmental product declarations for our products since already more than a decade. But the demand is more in certain regions in Europe. That is true. And of course, customers who are more, let's say, in the commercial sector and want to have the kind of certifications, they do know they want to do LCAs. But in other regions, there's less demand yet. So I think it's a sort of mixed picture, but it's definitely growing, yes.
Thanks. Demand is a keyword. Ian, you are with Ecosem. Can you maybe quickly introduce Ecosem, because it's not such a large company globally. Not everybody might know it. And can you talk about the demand for your product, the demand growth or demand challenges?
Yeah, sure. I guess just really quickly speaking to the individual, I guess the construction industry and real estate industry. I actually I'm relatively new to Ecosem, about 3/4 of a year. But before then, I was 15 years in the real estate, finance, and development sectors. And it's really interesting to hear, particularly what Christine and Jonna were saying with respect to the level of demand with respect to low carbon developments in the real estate sector. I think there's no lack of desire. A lot of people want to build low carbon buildings. However, I think there's just a complete lack of knowledge. So as to what a low carbon building means, I think instinctively people just turn towards energy emissions when they think about low carbon, and they think about turning off the lights and having escalators move more slowly at nighttime. But I think even now, speaking to my peers and former peers, their minds get blown still when they hear about embodied carbon and just how big embodied carbon is as a percentage of the total carbon footprint of a building. And I think we as advocates of low carbon futures, I think can sometimes get lost in speaking to each other about how important it is, and we all know how important it is. But the people out there financing these things and building these things often have no idea even know what embodied carbon is, let alone what makes up embodied carbon, the materials, etc. So I think from my first point of view, I think education it's all about education. It's all about explaining what embodied carbon is and what alternatives there are out there and how important that is to understand. So that's just my first point from the perspective of someone who used to be in the real estate industry and the construction industry. Ecosem itself is part of hopefully the solution of embodied carbon, in that we are a producer of low carbon cements and the sort of European leader in low carbon cements, low carbon cement technologies. And so I think from our point of view, we see very clearly the challenges first of all, we see very clearly the huge rise in demand for low carbon cement technologies. I think that's really, really welcome, and we're delighted to see that, not only from a company point of view, but also for what it can mean for the future of construction. But secondly, what we also see, unfortunately, is huge barriers that are in place to ensure that developments and construction projects are in a place where they can actually take advantage of low carbon solutions. So we see both sides of the coin. We see a huge opportunity there, but there are huge policy issues actually, which I'm sure we can get to in a few moments' time with some of the other questions, but particularly in terms of getting novel solutions into the market, there are very large barriers to entry and largely around the standards actually, which Philip made some very pertinent points around earlier on. So that's sort of what we're seeing at EcoSam.
Okay, thank you. Well, there are some comments in the Q&A box there which go in that direction. You know, what is a low carbon construction material? Does it have to be a nature-based material? Peter, can I ask you, it's one of the suggestions here in the chat box, what you would think from an architect's perspective about introducing mandatory carbon standards for building materials? It's one of the comments which we got here. Is that something you think would be practicable, would be reasonable? And then I'd like to hear Philip's opinion on that point as well.
Yes, I'm actually very proud of having lobbied for 7 years, you know, requesting the Danish government to introduce binding climate targets in the Danish building codes, and we're getting that from next year. And that will be for all buildings. We'll have a mandatory life cycle assessment done, and for buildings bigger than 1,000 square meters, there'll be a mandatory target. And what we see from introducing that and a roadmap for further reductions has been that it's really been stimulating a huge wave of innovation, of competence building, and so on, because everybody sees the inevitability of innovating in products and building solutions and so on. So I think it's very important to point out the regulation is also a driver for innovation, and it is creating a market for alternative solutions. So we actually think that there's a great benefit to introducing mandatory climate targets in building codes, and I would recommend that to any member state in the EU. I think it's a huge success, but of course we need to look beyond the new buildings, and we need to look about maintaining and retrofitting buildings too, because that's where the biggest impact will be, because the materials the use of materials is what we essentially need to reduce.
Yeah, thank you. Now, before I come to Philip, I actually would like to ask Jonna to react to this quite strong statement on mandatory standards. What's Kingspan's perspective on that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and regulation is a driver many times. So from our perspective, it's more to get the regulation right. And there, I think, Zsolt was mentioning that there's still gaps in how the embodied carbon data is being produced today. So it would be really good through the environmental product declarations and checking the raw material data in specifics to get that right, to get a really good level basic to then be able to regulate. I think that's important. Of course, also for circularity regulation, if you, for example, regulate on recycled content, then you would need to do a proper environmental impact assessment, because sometimes if you increase recycled content, it could have other impacts on embodied carbon or the performance of the product. So I think, to get the regulation right is really important.
Okay, thank you. I saw Christine waving, and maybe we just open your microphone for a moment, and before we give Philip an opportunity to react. Christine, please.
Yeah, no, I wanted to support what Peter Andreas said. I think, we have this net zero goal basically for operation, and we need a carbon budget as well for the embodied carbon for new construction as well as for renovation. But I wanted to comment on this data topic, because this is something we've been hearing since 2009, and it seems like there's never enough data. On the other side, we have to say, we don't have these kind of exact numbers, and a building is just something big and massive. So I think the general data is there to get started and show we can optimize and make it better over time. But I think it's this cannot be the reason that we always try to be perfect before we start something. So time is running out, and I think there's enough data out there. There are many companies who have EPDs today. There are data platforms. So I think this is really for architects, for investors. The tools are there, like I said earlier.
Okay, thank you very much, Philip. What's your reaction to what you have heard? How much data is enough data for you as a regulator to regulate? And how ambitious, how daring do you think, well, you can be and you will be?
Yeah, it's true that the data that we have is not very much, and we're aware that several member states are going ahead with legislation on whole life carbon declarations, in some cases only mandatory to calculate, in other cases also setting limit values or planning to set limit values in the future. But many other member states, not only there are no plans to do so, but maybe the construction industry as a whole is very unfamiliar with this notion. So we're kind of aware that we're in a difficult position because we're in a race against time, as we all know, with climate targets. And we saw the graph earlier of the action needs to be taken. But on the other hand, we also need to do what's realistic. The other point that I can make is that it's really the embodied carbon at the whole building level that is important, not necessarily at the individual product level, because you can very well design a building using products that have high sustainability criteria individually, but end up with a not very well performing building, not only from an energy point of view, but from a life cycle point of view as well. So so it's really the whole the assessment at the building scale that is key. And I think that we need to we need to go as far as we can right now. So we have all these initiatives that I've mentioned. We'll just have to wait and see what comes out in the other large package of stuff that is on the way towards the end of this year and possibly also into early next year. There are so many initiatives going on at the moment, but I mean I can't say at the moment what's going to be in some of these legislative initiatives that are currently being discussed still.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Peter, I think you raised your hand, and there is also a question for you. We actually now have three different discussion streams open, because some people answer in the Q&A box, others answer in the chat box. I'm trying to monitor them all. Peter, there is one question for you in the chat box, a devil's advocate question by Xavier. He's saying the industry says that the Danish embodied carbon benchmarks are not feasible. And on the other hand, science says they're not Paris aligned. Seems to be a crunch issue. What can be done in that matter? What's your perspective on that? You're on mute, Peter.
There we go. 2 years into the corona and we still have forgotten, right? I think that's a great question. Some think the targets are too ambitious or not feasible or out of reach. I disagree. I think that they are designed to allow everybody on board with the binding targets introduced next year, and then some reductions until 2029, 2030, and so on. From the perspective that Todd Salt introduced in the beginning, I don't think they are Paris aligned. Really, they aren't. But nothing that we are practicing at the moment is Paris aligned. So I think that Todd Salt's initial remark that we have a carbon budget, that is really what we should look at politically and design the carbon reduction targets towards. In that sense, I mean, I'm proud that we're introducing something in Denmark and that we've achieved something, but it's not enough. And I think yeah, we need to change focus and philosophy really.
Thank you very much, Jonna. This approach with a carbon budget, is that something which you think is feasible and applicable for a large construction material company like Kingspan? Would that be, one of the benchmarks you would want to apply?
And yes, we're kind of doing it already internally, and we have targets for ourselves, which are quite, they follow the Science-Based Targets Initiative, that's really will have a big impact for us. But of course, in our production line, the important factor for embodied carbon, for example, is the raw materials that we are manufacturing and their, carbon footprint. So it's very important that we are collaborating with our suppliers. So we have targets specifically to reduce the carbon footprint with, from our suppliers by 50% by 2030 to affect exactly that. So I think collaboration in the whole supply chains is needed for that.
Okay, thank you. We unfortunately have to close this panel, even though we're getting a lot of questions from the audience in the Q&A box. I'd like to encourage you all on the panel right now. There are a number of questions which are directly addressed to you, and there's the option to simply type the answer. So please feel free to do that in the remaining 30 minutes. But one final question to Philip again about the strategy on sustainable construction. I think there was an announcement earlier. There seems to be some confusion. What is happening with that? There's a strategy for a sustainable built environment, I should say, to be exact. Is there something new which you can share with us on that, maybe as the final comment for this panel?
Well, the Sustainable Built Environment Strategy had been announced in the Circular Economy Action Plan, and that was before the Renovation Wave. And what happened was a lot of what was planned was kind of front-loaded into the Renovation Wave, which is great for the Renovation Wave because it meant that the life cycle as a whole was considered there alongside energy efficiency. But it meant that we had to rethink the Sustainable Built Environment Strategy. There's, after all, no point writing a strategy and that doesn't have much content because the content's being put elsewhere. So it's, I mean, the line is that we're still considering it and considering what to do with it. But in the meantime, we're currently focused certainly on the transition pathway work, and that's what we're working on to the end of this year.
Okay, to really speed up the transformation of the sector. Okay, excellent. Well, with that, I know we really didn't have a lot of time, but with that, I would like to close this panel discussion. Please, I'd like to encourage you to answer to specific questions in the Q&A box. And we're now moving to the second panel, where we want to go more deeply into the policy perspectives. And I'm very happy to welcome Pau Garcia Audi from DG Energy. We have Ioannis Bakas from the European Environment Agency. We have Caroline Enronté from Leef Milieu Brussels, the Environmental Agency of Brussels. And we have Kieran Cuff, who's a member of the European Parliament with the Greens, the European Free Alliance Group. So welcome to all of you. You followed the discussion already in the earlier panel. You heard the short intro presentations. Well, we know there is quite a lot of appetite to regulate the topic of whole life carbon, to come to a more circular building and construction industry. Well, the big question is, how on earth are we going to do that? And I know that Brussels is quite intensively thinking about that topic. And because Brussels is a relatively small jurisdiction, I'm sure there are also already some experiences. And Caroline, I would like to invite you to maybe share some of the experiences of Brussels in regulating that topic, and maybe also give us some, maybe some hints, some advice, what could be done on the European level and what Kieran could introduce in the political discussion in 2022.
Yes, we've been working very hard on these topics, and I was really happy to hear that a holistic life cycle-based approach is essential. And I also think that, as Gonzalo was saying, the energy performance building directive is a very good start, and that's how we tackled it in the Brussels Capital Region. We have been developing a renovation strategy that is meeting the EU directive for energy performance. So the first aim is to reduce the direct emissions by working on the energy performance, but we really wanted to go larger and to also have a look at how can we tackle the indirect emissions. So we have some very clear objectives for the energy performance, and we're currently working also on a study to have a better idea of the emissions, the indirect emissions on the territory. But we're not waiting for numbers to be able to already define the road. So the idea is really to work on 3 different levels. The first one is to support sustainable and circular refurbishment. We really want to maintain as much as possible the built environment that we have, because as was said before, the environmental impact of new products, new building is really high. So if we can maintain what we have, well, that's the first step. A second step is we are also aware that some buildings will have to be dismantled, partially maybe, that every material that we can reuse has to be reused. So we're really supporting the reuse of materials and also the recycling. But the embodied energy of the materials is really important. So reuse is a first step before going to recycling. I know that a lot of people say, well, it's technically feasible, but economically it can be more difficult. And that's why we have been working also on experiments. So there are some calls on circular buildings, circular construction sites, where subsidies were given to experiment and to see how building materials could be reused within real refurbishments, real construction projects. And we think it's really important to tackle it in that direction for both reasons that on the one hand, we learn, we see till where we can go. And on the other hand, it's also enabling stakeholders to try certain things while having a technical guidance and also a financial support to take a little bit more risk. And it's really enabled us to see that we can go further. And at this stage in public procurement, we are integrating the reuse of products. We are also integrating life cycle assessment, of course. And one of the public procurements that we are guiding now is also integrating some objectives for reversible building design. So how to design buildings in such a way that they can be more easily adapted in the future to different functions, but also more easily disassembled so that we can reuse elements more easily. And that's also the third pillar on which we are working, design for deconstruction and for reuse, so reversible building design as we call it. And we had the luck to be able to work on the BAMP project, European funded Horizon 2020 project, which enabled us to learn a lot and also to develop the tools to support that further design. And another point that I would like to mention is the stakeholder participation. So within that strategy for refurbishment that is called Renovation, there is a public-private alliance, and that's enabling us also to check what is feasible and to involve all the different stakeholders. It enables to raise awareness. It enables to take into account some aspects that we might not have been taken into account and that are important for the implementation of the policy. So yeah, that's something that's really important for us, and that is, I think, essential for policy to work.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Caroline. I want to come back to that question about the stakeholder engagement, because I think that's a very important one. But before we do that, I want to ask Ioannis Bakas. Ioannis, you are a waste expert at the European Environment Agency. You have been modeling waste streams. Can your research confirm that there is really a lot that can be achieved with the right construction waste management? Does your data, does your research in the end encourage and confirm what Brussels wants to do?
Yes, thanks, Oliver. I think you're referring to a project we had a couple of years ago on improving the circularity of construction and demolition waste management. What we were trying to argue in that project was that the construction demolition waste management should focus a little bit more on the quality instead of the quantity. Because if we are to align our practices with the circular economy principles, which calls for maintaining the value of materials as high as possible, then we really need to avoid downcycling, like, for example, backfilling of construction demolition waste in landscape exercise, etc. So we really need to find ways to make the best out of the material we have at our hands when demolishing a building.
I was not unmuted. Thanks. Pau, this whole topic of reversive building design, of course, relates very much to to reducing embedded carbon, reusing materials. It doesn't have to do so much with operational emissions, with reducing the energy consumption when buildings are in use. But on the other hand, of course, when you do these, reverse activities, the reverse construction, you have a lot of opportunities to invest in energy efficiency at the same time. Is that something which DG Energy is looking at and taking into account? And I know a new EPBD proposal is in the making. I don't know to what degree you can talk about this at this point in time before it's being released, but maybe you can give the audience some indication whether DG Energy is looking at that topic.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. On the issue of whole life cycle, yes, we are definitely looking at it. I can't say exactly what are we proposing because everything is under consideration, but we are definitely looking at how we can address these. What are the first steps that we need to put in place? And on the issue of both deconstructions and integrating renovation and whole life cycle and the use of sustainable materials, there are a lot of projects that have been funded through EU funds in these last few years that look at both these aspects of integrating whole life cycle and renovation and energy efficiency, and disassembling also if necessary.
Yeah. In the perspective of DG Energy, is there more of a competition between energy efficiency, whole life carbon, and circularity, which you somehow have to solve in the legislative process? Or do you think they are so naturally and mutually reinforcing each other?
I definitely don't think there is a competition. I think it's part of a good job. If you and that's the same argument I would have used 10-15 years ago when we were discussing energy efficiency, when still energy efficiency, operational energy efficiency was the new kid on the block, so to speak. Like, if you do a good design, you want to make sure that you integrate the needs of the client, you integrate the needs of the user, you do it for a good budget, and you also look at how is the building going to be used throughout the whole life cycle, including how am I going to be able to disassemble it or partially disassemble it when the time comes. So for me, there is no competition. It's just part of what we should do anyway.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Kiaran, you and your colleagues in the European Parliament will have to react to the Commission's proposal on the EPBD, which is due mid-December. I think that's the current date, which is foreseen for the publication. What are your expectations when it comes to whole life carbon and circularity? And what role do you see for the two topics in the renovation wave? Do you see them almost as a side issue? We should focus on operational emissions to make sure we bring the carbon emission and the energy consumption down? Or do you think that these are topics which are as important as the operational emissions?
Oh, I think they're central, and I would be hoping for a high level of ambition from the European Commission in December. Certainly in my report on the renovation wave, I drew attention to the need for an evaluation of whole life carbon, but also I stressed the importance of working with communities in a bottom-up way to ensure that they are engaged and involved in the process. And I think we do want a whole life cycle performance roadmap. The Commission has said it will produce this maybe in 2023, but I think it's seminal to the discussions that we have. I mean, the Pritzker Prize award winners this year were a French couple who said that the most sustainable building is the building that's already built. And I think we have to put the retention of existing buildings full, square, and central into our discussions. But I think we also need an evidence base. I think we need to have a metric that will allow us to measure the embodied carbon that will be required in the renovation process. And maybe there's a sweet point which will allow us to better assess the perfect point of renovation. I'm sure it will be a deep renovation, but maybe is that an A1, A2, A3, B1, or whatever metric we're using in the particular country. I'd be interested in the kind of the evidence base, maybe the academic research that gives us that. But as well as that, we need to introduce sustainable building practices into the construction sector and lower the operational carbon. For instance, low carbon cement. Cement is, concrete is maybe 9% of global emissions. So anything we can do to prioritize the use of low carbon cement is clearly a step in the right direction. And I think member states should consider the embodied carbon in their long-term renovation strategies. And I think as well, there's a role for planning authorities to prioritize flexible buildings. In my home city of Dublin, we're seeing the demolition of many late 20th century office blocks. And ostensibly, the reason is that the floor to ceiling heights are too low. So perhaps if we require taller floor to ceiling heights in new buildings, they might be more adaptable after 20 or 30 or 40 years. And that could give us a lot more, a much greater contribution to reducing carbon in the long term. I spoke as well, I've spoken about building passports, and these could outline the materials and the products that have gone into a building. But I think the renovation passport will help us, but also the energy performance certificates. And having a pan-European approach to this really helps us greatly in all of this.
Thank you. Caroline, you said earlier how important the stakeholder consultation, the stakeholder integration into this whole process was. Well, what did the stakeholders really tell you when you came out first time with that idea? Was there happy embracement, or did people really have some serious concerns? And how did you then maybe overcome the concerns? And is there a role for these instruments which Kieran just mentioned, the digital building logbooks, the renovation passports, and all these things? Are you working with these? So two questions in one. Sorry for that.
Yeah. For the first question, in the beginning, when we were initiating more reuse of materials and also reversible building design, the first reactions were, this is going to cost way too much. We can't do this. It's not possible. And that's why we really think that supporting and informing and providing tools is really important, as well as the experiments I was talking about. Brussels Environment is also providing some trainings on all different levels, from energy performance to reversible building design to water management, etc. And so the role of public authorities is not only regulation, it's also supporting stakeholders to be able to achieve the objectives that are set. And we also see that bit by bit, by working with frontrunners in the first time, and having some examples that it works, and being able to also see what is the additional cost, is there really an additional cost, and how can we work around it, that actually the examples are inspiring also other people, and that's it's not business as usual yet at all, but the reactions are very different from 5 years ago. So being able to have that discussion and to involve stakeholders in what we are developing is essential. Another example that I find really interesting is we are working with stakeholders when we are developing our tools. We are working now on a checklist for reversible building design. And actually the checklist is very different from what we were initially aiming for, but it's a tool that is going to help designers during the design process. So it's not going to be a burden, something that we put on top of their work is going to be something that's going to help them. And I think that's also very important in the way how we are developing tools and how we are defining what we want to do. It has to be something that is being integrated in the practice of the stakeholders.
Thank you very much.
And there was
Caroline.
a second question, sorry.
Well,
building
the tools,
logbooks.
yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Do you use these tools? Are they something which you apply in Brussels? Are they being demanded by the stakeholders?
So we are working on a building passport, dwelling passport, to be more specific. And through the Building and Material Banks project, we have also been working on material passports. Brussels Environment as a region has a responsibility on building, and the federal government has a responsibility on materials. So here we are with the differences of policy levels, but we are communicating and we are sharing with the federal level on material passports, so that actually the requirements or the needs that we have on a building level are fitting. Because developing material passports that cannot be integrated in a building level would be difficult. And these tools are important to support the whole life carbon, because you have the energy performance that will be part of the building passport or the dwelling passport, but we also see it as a tool on the longer term. So it won't be done immediately at all, to add some other information with regards to the environmental impact, with regards to the reversibility, the adaptability, and it can be a tool that can share information on the performance of the building that is larger than only the energy performance. But that's a long-term vision. Yeah. So the first part will be on energy performance.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. Now, Pau, Caroline's agency is regulating, running these programs for a population of 2 million people in Brussels. The European Commission is regulating, making proposals on behalf of 500 million Europeans. So, of course, you can't provide the same level of detail for this large economic bloc. But can you tell me whether you think that the European Commission will maybe intensify its support to member states, its outreach, its provisioning of tools? I know, of course, there is the big Horizon Europe program. There is a lot of funding being put on the table. There are projects, but could you imagine, and this is maybe part of the next proposal, that the European Commission is providing much deeper, much more constructive support to the member states who then have to implement the legislation?
Yes, I would think so, at least. I mean, for example, one thing that we changed from 2010 to 2018 is that right after the adoption of the revised PPD in 2018, we also published a number of recommendations on how to transpose, and these recommendations were based a lot on the experience or the lessons learned in member states that maybe they were a bit more advanced or they had already experienced some of those issues. So this is definitely something that we will look at, how we can reinforce this role even more. You mentioned all the Horizon Europe. Yes, there was a lot of sharing experience there. There is also a lot of sharing experience and funds available for specific issues, including the recovery plans, for example. And let's not forget also perhaps one of the best instruments that we have at legislative level is the concerted action EPBD, which is a forum for member states to speak between themselves and really discuss, this has worked for me, this has not worked for me, or let's sit down and discuss how can we put in place these type of measures. And there they really talk in small groups. We are there also to discuss with them how we see things from an European perspective, etc., and how they can really all go in the more or less the same direction and bring things in a much more coherent manner.
Okay, thank you. Johannes, from your research, from the work you're doing at the European Environment Agency, is there potentially one silver bullet point, one tip which you would want to give to policymakers, which they definitely should include in a legislation which is addressing circularity and reducing whole life carbon?
Yeah, perhaps. Well, I think our work recently around these topics revolves around the words synergies and optimization. So I think until recently, anyway, the policy areas at also EU and national levels, they were built in isolation, but increasingly so, as the European Green Deal, of course, illustrates. The interlinkages or the synergies, the good side effects of doing something addressing one specific environmental issue can have a positive effect on something else. With our role at the EA, we are trying to provide arguments, environmental arguments for policymakers. This might be information or data or knowledge in general to policymakers. And what we're really trying to do at the moment is to provide quantitative arguments. This, I think, is the strongest type of arguments if you have the numbers there, yeah? So I think what's missing a lot is to have a metric or some sort of notion about the way that the synergies between circularity and climate change mitigation. So if you do make a building more circular, how much are you really contributing if you take into account both the embedded carbon and also the operational emissions? How much are you actually doing that?
Yep.
Another aspect we're working on is that we should really focus on innovation. With the current replacement ratio of buildings in the European building stock, concentrate on new builds, existing buildings by repurposing them, by renovating them, by remanufacturing even, have a great potential to avoid unnecessary new construction and to become circular themselves. So we're trying to figure out what are the best ranking in terms of climate potential circularity actions that you can do in the existing building stock. But
okay.
I would summarize all of this work very quickly by saying that I think we need to change our perspective a little bit. Buildings is a system where a lot of different demands meet. Demands for electricity, heat, water, and all these have interactions with the environment. So if we adopt a more systemic perspective in the building's environment as a whole, then that's the best way to identify the synergies and the best way to put forward policy options that address all of these at the same time.
Yeah. Thank you. We're coming already to the end of the webinar. Maybe just one quick final question, Kiaran, to you with the request for a short answer. Well, in the end, as a European parliamentarian, you are representing the European people. And I'm just wondering what you think, how much that idea of the many benefits resonates currently with the people, and how much more, well, education, awareness building is necessary. I mean, you come from Ireland. I know a lot is happening on that front in Ireland as well, and maybe there are some good Irish examples which you can tell us about.
Yeah, I mean, I think the climate and biodiversity crises demand a radical reevaluation of the energy we use, the buildings we live in, the way we travel, and what we eat. So I think we need extraordinary communication measures to bring people on this journey with us. I would look at the example from Ireland of the Tipperary Energy Agency and they set up an advisory service, superhomes.ie, who hold the hand of householders on the deep renovation journey. People are very confused. They replaced their oil boiler with a gas boiler, and now they're being told they need an air source heat pump. They put in insulation 10 years ago. Now they're told they need more. They need to change their windows. Should they do a shallow or a deep renovation? So technical assistance from one-stop shops at a local level, or indeed from the member state, are crucial, and constant communication. We can see the media interest in Glasgow in COP26. People want to know what they can do to help. But it's a really good message about renovations. It can tackle fuel poverty, it can create jobs, and it can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I think there's an open door on the messaging, but we need to get out there and sell the concept at every level.
Thank you. Yes, I do agree. People want to contribute to the solutions. And so I think it's the responsibility of policymakers to give them the right tools, the right standards, the right legislation, which really gives people an opportunity to engage in fighting the climate crisis. Unfortunately, we have already come to the end of this webinar. I would like to give the closing words to our partner in organizing this webinar, to Gonzalo from the EEB, to wrap us up before I will close the webinar. So Gonzalo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Yeah, I would like to take a minute just to thank everyone who has participated in this process and this discussion on behalf of the European Environmental Bureau, the BPIE and ECOS. Well, we organized these two events to give the opportunity to several stakeholders to share their visions, concerns, and thoughts on the big challenge that we have to decarbonize the built environment. And thanks to each organization that participated in the first meeting, and all the panelists and the speakers who participate today. And of course, Oliver, for your great moderation. And all contributions were key and useful to visualize the next steps. So we hope that all these discussions were fruitful and useful to facilitate a consensus on how to include a whole life carbon approach and circularity in the European law. And we will continue compiling all these contributions today and preparing a document that could be useful for all stakeholders and policymakers. And we really hope that the upcoming EPB revision includes the whole life carbon approach and circularity in an ambitious way to ensure that we can tackle together the big challenge that we have to decarbonize the built environment by 2050. There is no time to lose, and I hope that the incoming EPBD revision is ambitious enough. And as we can see today, all the stakeholders are ready to work on this. So thanks to everyone, and we will keep you updated on our following steps. So Oliver, over to you.
Thank you very much, Gonzalez, and a big thank you also from my side to all the panelists and the speakers. This was quite a tight and a short debate, and I know the topic is very complex, but I can also assure you this will not have been the last discussion. We as BPIE, together with our partners EEB and ECOS, are organizing. I'm certain that next year the discussions might even intensify once the proposals are out from the European Commission and once the European Parliament engages even more in the whole debate. So watch this space. We will be back. Thank you very much for all your contributions today. I wish you all the best. Have a wonderful rest of the day wherever you are. Stay safe and healthy, and until soon. Bye-bye.